So today we're going to be looking at female reproduction. So before we get too much in the female reproduction, I just want to point out one thing. If you remember the male, most of the anatomy of the male is external. But if you look at the female, there's very little external anatomy. Almost all of it is internal, and that's what we're going to look at first. And so if we're going to take kind of a tour through here, and we're going to see the ovaries, we're going to see uterine tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. So here's a sagittal section of the female. And so if you look at this, and here is the ovary, and there are two of these, and they're suspended inside the abdominal cavity. And then we have the uterine tubes, and uterine tubes are sort of trumpet shaped. So they are just like this, and then they get narrow. So they're sort of trumpet shaped, and again, there's two of those. And then we have a uterus, and there's only one uterus. But anyway, when you look at the uterus, it looks sort of like an upside down light bulb. And when you look at it, it has different parts to it. But down here, it gets thinner, and it has sort of a neck. Well, if you think about what the word for neck is, it's cervical. And so this area then, right here, this neck, is called the cervix. And then we have the vagina, and here's the vagina. And remember, the word vagina just means pouch is all it means. And so it's sort of just a pouch there to receive the penis, because remember, humans have internal fertilization. That's the internal part. Well, if you look at the external, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later on, but let's go back here, and you can see the external as well. So if you look at the external, there's this mound here. This is actually a fat pad. It's adipose tissue, and it's called the mons pubis, or the pubic mound. And then if you look at the external genitalia, what we have are two pairs of what are called lips, or labia. So there's the labia majora. Labia majora are the outer ones, and they're covered in skin. And then there's the labia minora, which are the inner ones, and they're just mucous membrane tissue. There's no skin. And if you look, then they create a space right here. And the space that's created is called the vestibule. And so if you look at the vestibule, it has two openings to it. One is there's an opening to the urethra. The other is there's an opening to the vagina. And so unlike males, when you look at the female reproductive system, the urethra has nothing to do with reproduction. Remember, in males, the urethra carries both urine and semen. And so it's a shared tube between those two systems. That's not true in the female. And then a couple other things that you can see in here. There are little tiny glands in here that keep this area moist. You can see them right there. Two pairs of glands. And then finally, we also have something that's very similar to the penis, and it's called the clitoris. But remember the penis, when we look at the penis, it had the corpora cavernosa, which were these chambers that fill up with blood. Well, this clitoris also has corpora cavernosa, just like before. And remember, we said that there's a glans penis. Well, this also has a glans clitoris. And then remember, there was a prepuce which covered up the glands. Well, there's also a prepuce here. And so these two organs are very, very, very similar. In fact, a good way of thinking about the clitoris is that it's just a very, very sort of tiny penis. If you look at that from the sagittal section, here are the two pairs of lips. So there's the labia majora and the labia minora. This space right here is this vestibule. Here's the space. And again, if you look here, this is where the urethra opens. It's also where the vagina opens. And then here is the clitoris. And again, It's erectile tissue, just like the penis. And so if you look in there, you can see all those little dotted things. That represents those vascular spaces, just like we had in the penis. And they fill up with blood when the female becomes sexually excited, just like what happens with the male. And then finally, there's also this little covering right here. And then again, that's called the prepuce, or sometimes it's called the foreskin. Any questions about any of that? That's just a sort of a little short tour through it, and we're going to come back and talk about each of these in detail. But any questions? Okay, well, let's look at the ovary first. So remember there are two of these, and the ovary, just like the testis in the male, this is the gonad. And remember, the gonad has two jobs, and one of those jobs is to produce gametes, just like in the male, and the other one is to produce hormones. And so that's exactly what we're going to see when we talk about this ovary. Well, it has some other things in common with the testis too. Remember, the testis had a thick, white, fibrous coat around it. It was called the tunica albuginea. Well, it's the same thing with the ovary. So if you do a section through it, there is that tunica albuginea. And again, it goes all the way around. Remember, tunica albuginea means white coat. And then if you look in the ovary, what you're going to see are two layers. Two layers. There's an outer layer, which is called the cortex. And that's where the gametes are going to form. And then there's an inner layer, which is called the medulla, which is basically just support tissue. And so it's blood vessels and things like that in it. And so when you look here, there's our tunica albuginea, this outer layer right here. This is the cortex, and it goes all the way around. And then here's the medulla here in the middle, where the blood vessels and so on are. And so that's kind of what it looks like in gross. There's another view of it. You can see the same thing. So let's talk about this and see how it's different from the testis. Remember when we talked about the testis, we said that we had these spermatogonia. And the spermatogonia were there when the male was born, but they didn't do anything until the male reached puberty. And then they started the process of producing sperm. Females are not like that. Females have what are called oogonia, and oogonia are these same sort of cells, which are plain old normal body cells, and they're enclosed in these little tiny, tiny, tiny sacs, which are called follicles. But unlike in the male, these oogonia start the process of meiosis before puberty. In fact, it happens while the female is a fetus herself. So in other words, inside your mother, if you're a female, inside your mother, when you were a fetus, in your own ovaries in here, before you were born, all this starts. And in fact, when you're born, every single egg, if you want to call them that, every single oocyte has already begun the process. And there's about 500,000 of them. So most females are born with about 500,000 of these follicles, and inside each one of those is this process has already started. It's not an oogonia anymore. It's a primary oocyte. So when you look in here, that's what we see. And look, they're in these little sort of like structures, which are sort of called nests. So there's a nest of these follicles. Here's a nest right here, and then that's that way all the way around. And when you look at this picture, this is not exactly what an ovary looks like, because what they're trying to show you here is all of the stages that it could be. So for now, forget about all of this other stuff over here. And if you think about the ovary, it's just full of these little things here. And again, when you're born, there's about 500,000, about 500,000 of these. And then what happens to them is slowly they all begin to die. So the older you get, the fewer there are of these. The fewer possible eggs, fewer possible oocytes. They get fewer and fewer and fewer. So we have these follicles with oocytes in them. Well, when you look at the follicle, remember they're called primordial follicles. Those are the ones you're born with. They're just one cell layer thick. So it's just a thin little cell layer around this. And it's simple squamous epithelium. So it's really, really thin around this oocyte. These cells here have a name. They're called theca cells. Theca cells. So if we look at this, there they are right there, or there they are right there. Those are those theca cells. But what's going to happen is when the female becomes sexually mature, when she goes through puberty, then once each cycle, some of these are going to begin to grow and they're going to begin to get bigger, and the follicle is going to get bigger too. So look, now there's more than one layer of cells. There's still that one layer right there, but there's, well, sorry, right there, but there's now these. Well, these cells have another name. They're called granulosa cells. So when you look at granulosa cells, here's our oocyte. Out here still this theca cells, one cell layer thick. But granulosa cells are going to begin to grow inside, close to the oocyte. And they're a different type of cell. These are cuboidal cells. And you can have one layer or two layers or 5 layers or 10 layers. They get bigger and bigger and bigger until they begin to look like that. So there's the theca cells right there, the little line that you see. Here are the granulosa cells here and here and here. And then there's the oocyte right there. And so the same thing on here. So here's our primordial follicles. Again, you're born with those, about 500,000 of them. And inside every one of those is a primary oocyte, not an oogonia, a primary oocyte, because it's already started the process of meiosis. And then they're going to get bigger and they're going to get bigger, and you're going to go through this cycle. And that cycle happens about, on the average, every 28 days. Any questions? And then finally, you're going to wind up with something that looks like this. So here is our oocyte. Look how big the follicle is now. There's the theca cells right there, this little purple dark line. These are all granulosa cells here. And these are also granulosa cells over here and over here, all these layers of cells. And it looks something like that. So we start out with the primordial follicle, which is one layer of squamous cells. These are the theca cells. But this is going to grow. Well, we don't call it primordial follicle anymore. As soon as it adds another layer of cells, as soon as there's granulosa cells, the name changes. It becomes a primary follicle. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then eventually an area filled up with fluid is going to form. And then it's called a secondary follicle. And that fluid-filled space is called the antrum. So look, if we look at it, there's primordial, there's primary, and look, there's our hollow space right there. Here's our little hollow spaces right here. So that's a secondary follicle. And then it's going to get even bigger. So primordial, primary, secondary. It's going to get even bigger. And what's going to happen is these little spaces are all going to fuse to form one big space. And that's called a Graafian follicle. It's also just called a mature follicle. And so if you look at a mature follicle, here's the mature follicle. So look, there's our antrum. It's got that liquid in it right there. There's our oocyte right there. Here's our theca cells. They never go away. There's the granulosa cells. And now this is a Graafian or mature follicle. And the next thing that's going to happen is this follicle is going to rupture. It's going to pop. And when it ruptures, when it pops, what's going to happen is the oocyte is going to be released along with all that fluid. And it looks like this. So here's the oocyte. Here's the fluid coming out. Well, look, some of those granulosa cells are going to come out with the oocyte because they're surrounding it. They're right here. They have a special name. They're called the corona radiata. So there's this thing that's going to pop, and that's going to become the corona radiata. There it popped. Here's the fluid that came out. There's the oocyte, and there's our corona radiata. Well, look, the follicle itself didn't go anywhere. It's still there. There's the follicle. But what's going to happen is under the influence of hormones, it's going to change. And it's going to turn into what's called the corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow. And corpus means body. So this is the yellow body. It's what's left of the ruptured follicle. And look, it even looks yellow. It looks yellow. And it makes hormones. And then what's going to happen is this yellow body's going to die. It turns into what's called the corpus albicans. Remember, alba means white. So now it's the white body. The white body. And the white body is basically just dead tissue. It's scar tissue is what it is. So it looks like a scar on the surface of the ovary. And you can actually, if you look in the ovary and count how many of these scars there are, you can tell how many times this ovary has gone through this process and ovulated an egg. So if you look in a very young female, there are going to be few of these, just a few. But if you look at a female in her 40s and 50s, there's going to be a bunch of these. So it's almost like a record that's being kept of how many ovulations happen. So let's go back through it one more time real quick. And again, you can see it all on here. So here they have all the stages listed on one picture. That is not the way an ovary looks like. It just has one of these stages, not all of them. But they put it on here to show you that it's a cycle. And so we start out primordial, and then remember, there's one layer of tissue. And then we go to primary. Primary is more than one layer of tissue. Remember, these are theca cells. This still has theca, but now it has granulosa cells. And then when it starts hollowing out like this, it becomes a secondary follicle. And those hollow spaces are called the antrum. And remember, they're filled with fluid. And they're going to get bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually they fuse into one big space. And then that's our mature follicle, or our Graafian follicle. And then we're going to get ovulation. And ovulation is when this follicle ruptures. And we're going to release the oocyte. But it's not just the oocyte. There's also these granulosa cells and the liquid that comes out. And the granulosa cells, remember, have a name. They're called the corona radiata. Corona radiata means crown, radiating crown is what it means. And then the follicle doesn't go anywhere. It stays here. But because of a hormone, it gets converted to this yellow body. And then the yellow body is going to die and turn into this white body. So yellow body, corpus luteum. White body, corpus albicans. And then it's just going to start all over again. And so it happens over and over and over again. And so it's a cycle that happens inside the ovary. Make sense to everyone? So can everyone look at a picture like this and pick out this cycle, starting here with the primordial follicles, and talk about what happens as you move all the way around? Any questions? That cycle, on the average, takes about 28 days. And you can divide it up into two parts, and they each last 14 days. The first 14 goes to here, and the second 14 goes to here. And this happens right in the very middle. It happens on day 14, or at least around day 14. But again, it's just a cycle that happens over and over and over again. Well, the ovaries, remember, are not like testes. Remember, they both form here in the abdomen, but testes, remember, descended into the scrotum. They descended through those holes, and so right around the time of the birth, remember, they're inside the scrotum. But remember the reason why? Anybody remember why the testis moved down out of the abdomen into the scrotum? There was a good reason for it. Anybody remember what it was? Remember, it was temperature. That's right. You cannot make sperm at core body temperature. You need a temperature of about 3 degrees centigrade less in order to do that. But the ovaries don't have that problem. There's no problem in making oocytes at core body temperature. It works just fine. And so there's no reason to move them outside of the abdominal cavity. They're a lot more protected in here. But they can't just float like floating in air. They're suspended in here. And they're suspended by ligaments. And there's actually 3 ligaments that hold them in place. I'm not going to ask you to remember the names of these ligaments, but they're important because they suspend the ovaries. They also suspend some other organs. So when you look in here, you can see the ligaments right there. There's an ovarian ligament, there's a suspensory ligament, and then there's a ligament called the mesovarium. They're suspended in here. A good way to think about these ligaments is to think about like coat hangers in your closet. Think about what would happen if you didn't have any coat hangers. You just threw all your clothes or your coats or whatever in the closet. They would just pile up on the bottom of the floor. And that's exactly what would happen to all these internal organs in your abdomen if you didn't have these ligaments. They would just pile up and they would actually get crushed. So these ligaments are really, really important. Any questions about that? So here's an ovary, and here's an ovary over here. And they go through the cycle, but usually only one or the other goes through the cycle. They don't both go through a cycle at the same time. They sort of seem to take turns. And some women can actually tell you when ovulation happens because they can feel it. It's called Mittelschmerz. It's a German word, but Mittelschmerz means pain in the side is what it means. And so some women can actually tell you the exact second or minute or whatever that they ovulate. So, ovaries. Well, then we have what are called the uterine tubes. Sometimes uterine tubes are called oviducts, but that's not used very much in humans. But anyway, a uterine tube, when you look at them, again, they're trumpet shaped. And the word for trumpet is salpinx. And so sometimes that word is associated with them. Because if you have your tubes tied, it's called a salpingiectomy. It comes from this word, which again means trumpet, because that's kind of what they're shaped like. So when you look at them, here they are. And look, it does look sort of like a trumpet. Well, it's divided into different regions. So the biggest part of the trumpet is the infundibulum. So if it's shaped like the trumpet, like this part would be the infundibulum. And the infundibulum, if you look at the very end of it, it has these little finger-like projections, which are called fimbriae. So there's the infundibulum, and here are the fimbriae. Those little finger-like projections become important when ovulation happens. Because in the female, these two are not connected to each other. You'd think it would be connected because this egg, this oocyte, is supposed to go in there. But they're not connected, which means that ovulation happens out here somewhere. And so we have to draw it in there. We have to suck it in there or pull it in there. Otherwise, it just floats off and goes somewhere else. It's estimated that about 1/3 of all ovulations are lost. They don't enter this tube. And so these little finger-like projections help that to happen. And again, they're called fimbriae. And then the next part of the tube is called the ampulla. And if you look at the ampulla, it's kind of curved. There's the ampulla. It has this curve to it. There's the ampulla over here. And it's also sort of fat or thicker here. It's an enlarged area. And in the ampulla, which is here, that's where fertilization usually happens. Right in here in this ampulla. And then the next part of it is a narrow part. And the narrow part is connected to the uterus. And that part is called the isthmus. So there's this narrow part right here. So that's the isthmus. There's the isthmus. So 3 sections. And so their job is to receive this ovulated oocyte, and they're also where fertilization happens. The reason fertilization happens here is because it takes about 8 days for this egg, this oocyte, to make it down into the uterus. But the egg only lives for 24 hours. So if fertilization is going to happen, it has to happen in the first 24 hours, and this oocyte is going to be in here. If you look in a cross section of them, so if you take a section and look at it, this is what it looks like on the inside. Look, there's a whole lot of smooth muscle, a whole lot of it. And the reason why is the oocyte is not like a sperm. Remember, a sperm has a tail and it can swim. But an oocyte doesn't have anything like that. And so it relies totally on waves of contraction to push the oocyte along. If you look on the inside layer right here, it's pseudostratified columnar. Pseudostratified columnar. And remember, pseudostratified has cilia, and you can see the cilia right here. And so those cilia also help push the oocyte in this direction. They move the fluid, and then the fluid drags the oocyte along with it. There are a bunch of these cells that have cilia, but there are also a bunch of cells that don't have cilia. They have microvilli. Remember, microvilli are cells with a folded up membrane at the top. It increases the surface area. And what happens is they secrete nutrients. So the nutrients then nourish this oocyte, and if it's fertilized, nourish the zygote and embryo until it gets down here. Because remember, it takes about 6 days to 8 days. And so during that time, up to 8 days, you still got to have nutrients. You got to have food source. And so lots of sugars are released. Lots of amino acids are released, all from these microvilli. Any questions about the uterine tubes? Well, remember, they're not connected to the ovaries. So when the oocyte is ovulated, it's not released into these uterine tubes. It's released into the peritoneal cavity. But the little fimbriae swell up right around the time of ovulation. And they actually begin to stroke the surface of the ovary, almost like fingers stroking your hand, or maybe a cat or something. They stroke it. And then the little cilia in here are going to create a downward current. So fluid is going to flow this way. And so hopefully all of that is going to pull this oocyte, which is ovulated out here, going to pull it in and then carry it toward the uterus. And so we're going to get these waves of muscle contractions. That's called peristalsis. And we're going to get all these cilia beating. That's what's going to move the oocyte toward the uterus. Any questions? So they look like that. Well, look, they're connected to the uterus. So they're hollow. You can see that hollow space. Remember, it's called a lumen. It's a tiny little hollow space. It's only about 2 times the size of a human hair. So it's very, very small on the inside. And that's going to allow this oocyte to move because it's constantly in contact with these cilia and it's constantly being pushed along by the muscles. And then when we get down here, this is hollow, so is the uterus. So the uterus also is hollow in here like this. And so our oocyte, or if it's fertilized, our zygote is going to go into the uterus. So you can see the opening here and then down into the uterus. So let's talk about the uterus. Now, before we do that, remember that not only are the ovaries suspended inside the abdominal cavity, but so is all of this. And so there are ligaments which suspend the uterine tubes as well. And these are called the mesosalpinx. There's that word again. It means trumpet. It refers to these uterine tubes. But anyway, the mesosalpinx is this right here, this ligament. And so it suspends or helps hold them in place. Okay, let's look at the uterus. So remember the uterus, if you look at it, it looks like an upside down light bulb. And it's hollow in the middle. It's also a very, very muscular organ. Look at all the muscle. There's that much muscle. It's a thick muscular organ. Well, when you look at it, it has regions to it also. This region up here that forms this dome shape right here is called the fundus. This region right here, which is the largest part of it, is called the body. And then remember this down here is like a neck, and that's called the cervix. So we have a fundus, we have a body, and we have a cervix. And then right where the cervix connects to the uterus, right there, that is called the isthmus. So it looks like this. So fundus, body, isthmus, and then we're going to have the cervix. Well, if you look at the cervix, remember the word means neck. And so it's this narrow area down at the bottom, and it projects into the vagina. And if you look at it, there's a little tiny tube that runs right through the center of it, a little tiny canal. Well, that tube is normally plugged up. It's normally plugged up with mucus, so nothing can go either direction. there's a whole lot of glands that secrete this mucus. And what it does is it blocks this cervical canal. Well, if you look at the cervical canal, it has two openings. So there's one right here, which opens into the vagina. And there's one right here, which opens into the uterus. Well, each of these openings is called an os. Os means mouth. So look, it has two mouths. It has an external and it has an internal. So if we look at it, it looks like this. So there's the cervix. There's that canal. So there's our external os. And right there is our internal os. And then between those two, this little tube right here is the cervical canal. And again, remember there's a lot of little glands in there, and this is normally plugged up. It's plugged up because this is outside out here. And there's a lot of bacteria out here. In fact, there's bacteria in here. Well, if those bacteria were to make their way up all the way through here and all the way through here, they could go out into the abdominal, the peritoneal cavity. And they could cause all kinds of problems with sickness and infection. You get peritonitis. And so that mucus plug is there to keep the bacteria from being able to go any further. But twice each month, this mucus thins out. It thins out. And it hangs down in little tiny strands like this. And so now this is open. Well, it only happens twice each month. It happens once during what's called menses. We'll see this in a minute, but bleeding is going to happen. And the blood needs to have a way to get out. And the other time it happens like this is during ovulation. Because if there's sperm, the sperm have to be able to swim up. And so they have to have a path to get in here. If you look at the uterus, it has 3 layers to it, 3 layers in its wall. You can see the 3 layers here. There's one layer that's very, very thin. That's the outer layer. There's one thick layer in the middle and another thin layer on the inside. So we have the outer one called the perimetrium. It's the outer layer. The middle one is the myometrium. That's the middle layer. And it's called myo because it has smooth muscle in it. Lots of smooth muscle. And then the inside layer is the endometrium. And that's a mucous membrane. So if we were to blow it up, it would look like this. So here is the perimetrium. Here is the myometrium. And here is the endometrium. And then remember, it's hollow. It has a lumen in it. Well, look how much smooth muscle there is. There's a ton of smooth muscle, this much. All of this is smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle is going to become important when talking about things like labor and delivery. If we blow it up even more, you can still see the different layers. Now, this one you can't see very easily, but that's the perimetrium. It's very, very, very thin. It's simple squamous epithelium. because what it is the visceral peritoneum. That's all it is. The visceral peritoneum. Simple squamous epithelium. And so it's very, very thin. Very, very thin right there. And then here's the myometrium right here. That's the muscle. And then here is the endometrium. Well, if you look at the endometrium, it has two layers of its own. So if we go back and look, you can even see it in this picture. This looks different than this. Well, this layer is a layer that does not change very much. It stays pretty much the same. But this other layer changes dramatically, changes like crazy as you go through that cycle. And so their names, the one that doesn't change very much is called the stratum basalis. Stratum basalis pretty much stays the same. It does not respond to hormones. But the layer, this one, changes dramatically. And so it's sort of called the functional layer, the stratum functionalis. And so it does respond to these hormones. And what it does is it grows, it becomes very, very secretory, and then it sloughs off. It's shed during menstruation. And you can see the two layers here. There's our one that doesn't change. There's the one that does. And depending on where you are on the cycle, remember this is going to grow. It's going to become secretory. And then it's going to be shed during menstruation. So it looks, depending on which part of the cycle it looks, it could be very, very thin, it could be growing, or it could be very, very thick and secretory. Well, as it grows, blood vessels and cells and glands, all these things grow with it. So all of this is new growth. But remember, at some point, it's going to be shed. Look at these arteries. They're very weird. They're spiral. The reason they're like that is because when menstruation happens, they tear. So you're going to get bleeding. But because of this weird shape that they have, when they tear, they snap back. They don't just get cut off like an artery might. They get snapped back, and it creates this space for a clot to happen. And so these arteries, because of the shape they have, they reduce blood loss during menstruation. So the chance of a female bleeding to death during menstruation is very, very low, because a clot forms pretty easily on these spiral arteries. But look, this is what happens. So it grows, becomes secretory, sloughs off. Grows, becomes secretory, sloughs off. Grows, becomes secretory, sloughs off. So it's also a cycle. So if you look here, here's where it's sloughing off, and all that tissue and blood. Remember, it has to have a way out. And so remember, that's one of the times when that mucus is going to disappear. That plug is going to be gone. And so you get menstrual flow. But then what's going to happen is, under the influence of hormones, this is going to begin to repair itself. And it's going to grow. And then under different hormones, not only does it get repaired and grow, but it becomes secretory. It secretes like crazy. It secretes nutrients for this embryo, if there is one. And then it sloughs off and it starts all over again. So it's a cycle. So if we look at this endometrium, remember we have two zones. Here's our zone that really doesn't change very much. And there's the zone that does. Well, look, it's not very thick right now, but it's going to grow. And these are glands that are forming in here. And it's going to get thicker. And look how many glands there are in here now. And those glands secrete. And then it's going to slough off. And so we're going to get bleeding. Again, it's a process that happens over and over and over again. It's a cycle. Any questions about that? We'll come back to it some more later on, but hopefully you have some idea of what's going on here. Okay, and then remember we got these arteries. Well, the arteries that are different are these spiral arteries. The spiral arteries are the ones that snap back when they rupture. And when they snap back, sort of, they make it easier to clot. But there are other arteries which are normal arteries. So we have very large arteries going to the uterus, and then they branch, then they branch again, and then they branch again. And then finally, these little arteries, which go to the stratum basalis, give rise to the spiral arteries. So there's our uterine artery, and there's our arcuate, and there's the radial arteries, and then here is the little straight arteries, and there's the spiral arteries. Any questions? So again, it's going to grow, it's going to become secretory, and then it's going to slough off. It's going to grow, become secretory, and it's going to slough off. So there's this cycle going on. So look, there's two cycles that we talked about, one in the ovary. And remember what happens? We're going to start with a primordial, it becomes a primary, and then a secondary, and then it becomes this Graafian follicle, and then we're going to get ovulation. It's going to turn into a corpus luteum, corpus albicans, then it's going to start all over again. And then here we're going to have sloughing off, and then we're going to have growth, and then we're going to become secretory, and then it's going to happen again. Well, look, these two cycles are connected to each other. They happen at exactly the same time. So remember, the whole cycle takes about 28 days. Well, that's true for both of these. So here's day 0, and here's day 28 over here. It's exactly the same here. Here's day 0, and here's day 28 over here. And so here's when ovulation happens. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to prepare the uterus in case the female becomes pregnant. Remember, ovulation happens on day 14, and then it takes about 6 to 8 days to reach the uterus. So if we take day 14 and add 6 to 8 to it, look, we're right here, which is the peak of when the uterus is most receptive, most hospitable. And so that's when this fertilized egg would arrive. And so it's really important that the cycles match up. Because think about it, if they didn't match up, what if this was shifted over here? In other words, what if when the fertilized egg got here, the female was going through menses or menstruation? Well, not only would the wall of the uterus slough off, but so would this fertilized egg. It would be sloughed off and lost. And then again, what if it's not even that bad? What if it gets here and it's only this well prepared? There's no nutrients being secreted. There's nothing to provide nutrition for this developing embryo. So it's really, really important that these two cycles match up. And we're going to see how that happens. It happens because of hormones. But we're not going to talk about that today. Any questions? Well, just like we had ligaments for the ovary and we had ligaments for the uterine tubes, excuse me, there are also ligaments for the uterus. Well, these are actually the most important ones. If you look at a non-pregnant uterus, it is not very big and it is not very heavy. But think about what happens to that uterus as a female, as the pregnancy progresses. It's going to get bigger and thicker and bigger and thicker. There's the fetus inside it, plus there's about 20 liters of fluid inside it. And this whole thing, right at the end of pregnancy, can weigh like 40 pounds. So remember we said you can think of these things like clothes hangers. But think what would happen if you put a 40-pound coat on a clothes hanger. And unless that clothes hanger was really, really, really strong, the thing would break and the coat would just fall. Well, that's exactly what happens here. We have these very, very strong ligaments. If they're not strong enough, what's going to happen is the uterus is going to fall. And so there are several sets of ligaments. We have the lateral ligaments, we have the uterosacral ligaments, we have the round ligaments, and we have the mesometrium. So here's what those ligaments look like. Remember, ligaments are dense, regular connective tissue. They're like ropes. And so these are ropes holding the uterus in place. Here's what it really looks like. Make sense? Any questions? So here's those ligaments. Broad ligament, mesometrium. I don't see the others, but anyway, the ligaments. So they're going to hold this uterus in place. You can also see the layers here. You can also see the hollow space, and you can see this cervix and the cervical canal and the external os and the internal os. And remember, normally this is plugged up with mucus. Any questions? Okay, let's look at the vagina. So remember, the word vagina just sort of means pouch. And that's exactly what it is. If you look at it, look, it's a pouch right here. And the pouch is to receive the penis. That's really pretty much its only job, except it's also the birth canal. Because if a female becomes pregnant, once the fetus develops in here, eventually it's going to have to get out. Well, unless you do a C-section, the only other way out is through the vagina. So, two jobs. Well, it's basically just a tube. It's a thin-walled tube. And again, it's a pathway for the birth. It's also for copulation. Oh, and I forgot to tell you, it's for also how the menses are going to get out. Well, when you look at it, it also has these 3 layers or 3 coats. So if you look at it from the inside out, inside is stratified squamous. Remember, stratified means you have more than one layer. In fact, you have lots of layers. So if you look at the basal layers, they look like this. But as you get further and further away, remember that it gets very, very, very flat. But there's a lot of layers. So this tissue is adapted for abrasion. It resists abrasion. And abrasion happens during copulation. And so during copulation, some of these layers might get rubbed away. But there's still plenty of layers underneath so that not all of them get rubbed away. And then there's a middle layer, and the middle layer is smooth muscle. And so, just like anywhere else, smooth muscle can contract. And then finally, there's an outer layer, which is called an adventitia, and it's fibrous connective tissue. It also has a lot of elastin in it. And so it's strong, but it's also stretchy. So when you look at it, it looks like this. Well, in an unexcited female, the vagina is only about 4 to 5 inches long. And the inside of it folds up like an accordion, like this. So on the inside, it's all folded up. And these folds are called rugae. But what happens when a female becomes sexually excited is very similar to what happens when a male becomes sexually excited. Blood rushes to the area, arteries dilate, and what happens is those folds flatten out. And so the length goes from about 4 to 5 inches to about 7 to 8 inches. If you look at the opening to the vagina, here it is. Well, in young females, there's a membrane which covers up, completely blocks the opening to the vagina, and that's called the hymen. The hymen, though, around puberty, under the influence of hormones, becomes very, very thin. And it's very, very easily torn. So most females, if they have any sort of active life at all, this hymen gets ruptured by their day-to-day activities. Has to do with sports or anything like that. Or an insertion of a tampon. All of those things would cause this to rupture. Now, if it doesn't rupture naturally, then it's ruptured during the first copulation. So that's back here somewhere. And then finally, remember we have this external genitalia. And so if we look at the external genitalia, remember it looks like this. We kind of talked about it a little bit already. But what we have are this pubic mound, which is adipose tissue. And what it does is it covers up the pubic bone. And so it provides a cushion to prevent the pubic bone from being damaged during copulation. And then there's two sets of these lips. So we have the labia majora. The labia majora have fat in them. And so they're skin covered, but they're hair covered in the adult. They're very, very similar. In fact, they come from the same tissue as the scrotum in the male. And so there's a word for that. It's called homologous. It comes from the same tissue. So the exact same tissue that created the scrotum in the male creates the labia majora in the female. And then we have the labia minora. Remember, these are not hair covered at all. They're hair free. It's a mucous membrane. And this is also homologous to the corpus spongiosum. Remember the corpus spongiosum of the penis? Comes from this exact same tissue. And remember, in the male, the corpus spongiosum has the urethra running right through the center of it. Well, if you look at this, there's the urethra right there. And here's this corpus spongiosum-like structure surrounding it. There are also glands here. There are two sets of glands. There are these, which are called the greater vestibular glands. And the greater vestibular glands, when you look at them, they're about the size of a pea. They're homologous, comes from the same tissue, as the bulbourethral glands. Remember, bulbourethral glands produce this fluid, which is called pre-ejaculatory fluid. And pre-ejaculatory fluid has a whole lot of mucus in it, a lot of mucin in it. And that's exactly what this is here. These glands produce a fluid containing a lot of mucus. And that keeps this vestibule area moist and lubricated. So that's these glands right here. There's another pair of glands, I guess I don't have it on the slide, but these tiny little glands right here, they're called the paraurethral glands. And the paraurethral glands also do something similar to these glands. And then finally, we have the clitoris. And we talked a little bit about the clitoris already. Here's the clitoris. And remember, it's homologous to the penis. And so if you look at it, it's vascular tissue. It's erectile tissue. It has a prepuce. It has a glans. I don't know if I have that picture. I guess I don't. But it looks very much like a very small penis. It has two corpora cavernosa, just like the penis does. It has this glans. It has crura, just like the penis does. Next time I'll try to get a picture of that. And then the last thing is, if you look here, there's sort of this diamond-shaped area right here. This area is called the perineum. So the perineum is sort of this diamond-shaped region. And so it's shaped like this. And there are bony appendages at each one of these things. Right here is the pubic symphysis. Here are the ischial tuberosities. And here is the coccyx. And so this bony diamond is the shape that the fetus is going to have to go through if it's born. It's very hard to move bone. So bone and bone and bone. And so if you measure this perineum, you can have a good idea if there's going to be problems with childbirth. Because again, the head, even though it's malleable, remember, has those fontanelles, the head has to go through here. And the head is by far the largest part of a fetus. And then the very last thing is females, remember, have mammary glands. So if you look at mammary glands, they look like this. Well, this is not a mammary gland. That is a breast. And the breast is actually mostly fat. Look, it's got a lot of fat in it. Humans are the only animals that maintain an enlarged mammary gland or a breast. Humans are the only ones with breasts. Even our closest relatives, like chimpanzees and bonobos, they don't have breasts. Now, they do have mammary glands, but they don't have breasts. But if you look at the mammary glands are sweat glands. They're modified sweat glands. They're apocrine. If you remember that from A&P1, we talked about the different types of glands. These are apocrine. So remember, the tops of the cells pinch off. And so that's released. And so if you look at milk under a microscope, what you're going to see are little pieces of cells because the tops pinch off. These mammary glands can be very, very large if the woman is lactating, or very, very small if the woman is not lactating. Males also have these same glands, but in males they're very small and they're usually, of course, not functional. But if you give a male the right hormones, they actually would become functional because they, just like everything else, are regulated. There's also a pigmented area. That's called the areola. The pigmented area has thicker skin, and it also has sebaceous glands. And so remember, sebaceous glands are oil glands. And so this area then remains thicker, and it's also more flexible and resistant to abrasion. And that's what happens with the suckling, or what happens with nursing. And then if you look at the breast, sometimes the breast is actually fairly heavy, and so it needs something to support it. And so there are little tiny ligaments that run throughout the breast, and these ligaments attach the breast to the external muscles, to the pectoralis major, and they hold it in place. Here you can see them over here a little bit better. But just like anything else, over a long period of time, if you apply enough weight or force, these ligaments stretch. And so the shape of the breast changes over time because of that. And then if you look inside in these sweat glands, what you're going to see are there little alveoli in there that produce milk. And then the milk goes from these glands into these little ducts. The ducts then are called lactiferous ducts. And the lactiferous ducts then join to form these little enlarged areas, which are called lactiferous sinuses. And then finally it comes out the end of the nipple. Any questions? So that is the anatomy of the female, and that's where I plan to stop today. Anybody have any questions at all? So next time when you come back, we're going to pick up and talk about how the eggs are formed. And first we're going to talk about oogenesis, but we're going to do that next time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.